The preacher's words cracked in the cold, thin air of Wyoming territory. They were dry words, about dust and ashes, and they meant nothing to Eleanor Briggs. She stood on a little hill that was not much more than a bump in the flat. Gray land. The wind tried to steal the bonnet from her head, and she held it with one hand, the cloth worn slick between her fingers. With her other hand, she held the small fist of her youngest son, Jacob. Jacob was 5, and he was watching a hawk circle over the prairie, not understanding that the man they were lowering into the hard ground was his father. Her older boy, Samuel, who was 8, stood stiff as a fence post. He was not crying. He had not cried since the fire. He just watched the pine box, his eyes as old as the hills. Eleanor watched, too. The grave was shallow. The ground was already fighting the shovel, getting ready to freeze up for winter. They were burying her husband, Josiah, near what was left of their barn. The barn was just a collection of black, jagged bones sticking out of the ground, still smelling of soot and dead animals. The preacher, a young man with a face raw from the wind, finished his prayers. He looked at Eleanor, waiting for her to do something, to weep or to throw the first handful of dirt. She did nothing. She was hollowed out. She could not feel the cold, or the grief, or the small hand inside her own. All she could feel was the emptiness where Josiah used to be, and the sharp, bright terror of what was coming next. The preacher nodded, understanding her silence, and he and the 2 men who had dug the grave began to shovel the rocky dirt back into the hole. The sound was hateful. It was the sound of finality. Thud, scrape, thud. Josiah had not been a complicated man, but he had been a good one. He had been strong, and he had worked this land until his hands were cracked and stained, and he had died for it. It was the ranchers, the big outfits with thousands of cattle, that had done it. They wanted this creek. They wanted this whole valley. They did not like homesteaders, and they especially did not like a homesteader who had died of lung fever the year before, leaving a woman alone with 2 boys. They had tried to buy her out. They had threatened, and when she would not budge, they had ridden down one night, drunk and laughing, and set fire to the barn. Josiah had run out with his rifle. He had been shot before he even pulled the trigger. He did not die right away. He had lived for 2 days, coughing blood onto the cabin floor, while Eleanor sat beside him, holding a wet cloth to his head, pretending he was not leaving her. Now he was gone. The fire had taken the barn, the 2 milk cows, the mule, and all the hay they had cut for winter. All she had left was the small cabin, which had been spared only because the wind was blowing the right way, and her 2 sons. Winter was not just closing in, it was already here, breathing its ice down the neck of the underscore plains. She had a sack of flour, half a barrel of salt pork, and not much else. She had no man to hunt, no man to chop the heavy wood needed to fight off the deep cold. She was one of many. Widows were common out here. They were seen as problems to be solved, or nuisances to be pushed off. Eleanor Briggs was a nuisance. The men finished. They tipped their hats, their faces grim. "Ma'am," one said, and that was all. The preacher murmured, "The Lord comfort you, Mrs. Briggs." Eleanor just nodded. She watched them walk their horses back toward the distant speck of a town. Then it was just her, and Samuel, and Jacob, and the wind, and the fresh, dark rectangle of dirt on the hill. "Go inside, Samuel," she said. Her voice was rusty. "Take your brother. Stoke the fire." Samuel looked up at her. His face was pale, his eyes too big. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask why his father was in the ground. He wanted to ask what they would eat, but he did not. He just took Jacob's other hand and pulled him toward the cabin. Eleanor waited until the cabin door shut. She looked at the burned barn, and then at the grave. She let out the breath she felt like she had been holding since the fire. It came out of her in a cloud of white, but it gave her no relief. "I will not let them win. Josiah," she whispered to the dirt. I will not let them starve us out. I will not. She walked back to the cabin. The smell of smoke was still in her clothes. She went inside and shut the door, bolting it. The single room was cold, even with the small fire in the stove. Samuel was sitting on his cot, staring at the flames. Jacob was already asleep, his small body curled under a quilt, exhausted by things he could not name. Eleanor sat at the small, rough table Josiah had built. For an hour, she did nothing. She just sat in the failing light, the silence of the room pressing in on her. She was 28 years old, and she was done. The fight had gone out of her with Josiah's last breath. But then she looked at her sons. She looked at Samuel, pretending to be a man already, his shoulders stiff with a burden he was too young to carry. She looked at Jacob, his face soft in sleep. The terror she had held back at the grave finally came loose. It was not a fear of loneliness. It was a fear of the cold, a fear of starvation, a fear of the silence when her boys stopped asking for food because they knew there was none. That night, she pulled an inkwell and a sheet of paper from Josiah's small wooden box. Her hands were shaking. She lit the lantern, the precious oil burning low. She dipped the pen. She had heard of it, of course. Women back east, reading magazines, looking for husbands, and men out west, desperate for a wife, a partner, someone to share the crushing loneliness. But this was different. This was not about loneliness. It was about survival. It was a trade, a homestead for a man. She wrote to an agency in Chicago, one she had seen advertised in a newspaper months ago, back when the idea had made her skin crawl. To whom it may concern. I am a widow. My husband is deceased. I have a homestead of 160 acres in Wyoming territory. I have 2 sons, aged 8 and 5. The land is good, by a creek, but my barn has burned and my livestock is gone. She stopped. The shame was so thick in her throat she could hardly breathe. She was selling herself. She was replacing Josiah like a broken tool. She crossed out the last line. They did not need to know her troubles, only her needs. I require a husband. He must be a strong man, sober, kind, and willing to work. I will be a good wife to him. He will have a home and a family. Please send someone suitable by the earliest transport. She signed her name, Mrs. Eleanor Briggs. She folded the letter. She had to ride 10 miles to the nearest stage post to send it, and it cost money she did not have. She had to sell Josiah's pocket watch, the last thing she had of his besides the land and the boys. She posted the letter and rode home, feeling like the worst kind of woman. She did not tell Samuel. She did not tell anyone. She just waited. She chopped what wood she could, and she counted the dwindling supplies, and she prayed, not for a good man, but just for a man, any man who could hold an axe and a rifle. Hundreds of miles away, in a town that had sprung up overnight around a silver strike, Thomas Reddick was bleeding. The saloon was loud. It was the kind of place built in a week, all raw pine and smelling of spilled whiskey, sweat, and cheap cigars. It was packed with men who had not seen a woman in months, and who carried their fortunes in their pockets and their desperation in their eyes. Thomas was sitting at a back table, playing cards. He was not a good card player. He was just a man trying to turn his last $20 into enough to get him out of Wyoming. He was quiet, his hat pulled low. He didn't like noise, and he did not like crowds. But he was cornered. A man across the table, a big, loud man with a greasy beard, threw his cards down. That's 3 times. Reddick, 3 times you pull the card you need. Thomas did not look up. He just pulled the small pot of coins toward him. Luck of the draw, friend. I ain't your friend, the man said, standing up. His chair scraped loud, and the saloon went quiet. And you ain't lucky. You're a cheat. Thomas sighed. He had been in this situation before. He was tired of it. He was tired of running, tired of these boom towns, tired of men like this. He kept his hands on the table, palms up. "I'm not looking for trouble," Thomas said, his voice low and rough. "Well, you found it." The big man went for his gun. He was slow, clumsy with drink. Thomas was not. Thomas was a man who had lived by his reflexes for 10 hard years. He did not go for his own gun. He grabbed the whiskey bottle from the center of the table and smashed it across the man's face. The man roared, grabbing his bleeding face. But as he fell, his finger clenched on the trigger. The shot was deafening. It was a flash of orange light in the smoky room. Thomas felt it before he heard it. A white-hot poker slamming into his left side. Just above the hip. The force of it knocked him backward, out of his chair. He hit the floor, the breath gone from him. The big man was on his knees, howling, trying to wipe the blood and glass from his eyes. He was fumbling to raise his pistol again. Thomas pulled his own gun. He shot the man once, in the chest. The man looked surprised, sat down hard, and then fell over, dead. The saloon was dead silent. Thomas looked at the smoking hole in his own gun, then at the man he had just killed. He hated this. He hated the smell of gunpowder, hated the sticky feeling of his own blood spreading under his shirt. "He drew first," someone whispered from the bar. Thomas knew it did not matter. The man he shot might have had friends, or the town marshal might decide he did not like a stranger killing a local. No matter the reason. And Thomas Reddick was wanted in 2 territories already. He could not afford to talk to a marshal. He grabbed the edge of the table and hauled himself up, gritting his teeth against the fire in his side. Blood was soaking his trousers. He needed to get out. He grabbed the money he had won, stuffing it into his pocket. His eyes fell on the dead man's coat, slung over the back of the chair. He needed a fresh horse, and he needed supplies. He jammed his hand into the coat pockets, looking for money. He found a worn leather wallet. Inside was a wad of cash, more than Thomas had seen in a year, and a sheaf of papers. One was a ticket for the stagecoach leaving that night. Another was a letter. Thomas leaned against the wall, the room starting to spin. He forced his eyes to focus on the letter. It was from a mail-order bride agency in Chicago. "Mr. Arthur Waits," it read. "We are pleased to inform you that we have matched you with a party in Wyoming Territory. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs. She has a homestead. Enclosed is her letter and a ticket for the stage to Cheyenne, where you will transfer to the Lander Line stage." Thomas's blood ran cold, then hot. He looked at the dead man. Arthur Waits. He was on his way to marry a widow. Thomas looked down at his own wound. It was bad. He could feel the blood pulsing out, hot and fast. He could not make it to the mountains. He would not last 2 days on the run, not with winter coming and a hole in his side. He would be tracked, or he would bleed out, or he would freeze. But a stagecoach, a homestead, a widow who had never seen Arthur Waits in her life. It was a crazy idea. It was the idea of a desperate, dying man. He looked at the dead man's face. He looked at the letter from Eleanor Briggs. A strong man, sober, kind, and willing to work. He was not strong, not right now. He was rarely sober, and he had not been kind in a very long time. But he was willing to work, if the work meant staying alive. He stuffed the papers and the money into his own pocket. He put his gun back in its holster, pulled his hat down low, and walked out of the saloon. He did not run. He just walked. His left hand pressed hard against the hole in his side, leaving a trail of dark, glistening drops on the saloon floor. He made it to the livery, bought a fresh bandage and a bottle of laudanum from the stable hand, and paid for the dead man's horse. He waited in the alley, shivering, the laudanum doing little for the pain, until he heard the stagecoach whistle. He used Arthur Waits's ticket and pulled himself inside, collapsing into the dark corner of the coach, invisible to the other passengers. He was just another shadow, running from the light. 2 weeks later, Eleanor was in town, buying a small amount of flour with the last of her egg money, when the station master handed her a telegram. Her heart stopped. Telegrams only meant death or disaster. She tore it open with trembling fingers. Arriving lander stage. Friday. Waits. Today was Friday. Eleanor stood frozen on the boardwalk. He was coming. Today. The man she had bought. The man who was coming to take Josiah's place. She felt a wave of sickness. Shame washed over her. So hot and sharp it made her dizzy. What had she done? She had invited a stranger into her home, into her life, with her boys. She did not even know his name. No, she did Waits. Arthur Waits. She ran her errands in a fog. She bought a small piece of candy for each of the boys, a guilty offering. She felt the eyes of the town on her. Did they know? Did they know that Josiah was barely cold in the ground and she had already sent for another man? She raced the wagon home, pushing the old horse harder than she should have. She got back to the cabin and looked at it with new, critical eyes. It was small. It was dirty. The floor was packed earth, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the logs. "Samuel! Jacob!" she yelled, her voice frantic. "We have to clean. We have company." "Who? Ma?" Samuel asked, looking up from the wood he was trying to split. "Just company. Help me. We have to sweep the floor. Jacob, put your blankets away. Fold them neat." She worked like a mad woman. She scrubbed the table. She washed the few windows until the glass was thin. She changed the linens on her bed, the bed she had shared with Josiah. And then, shaking, pulled the quilt off and threw it in a corner. He could not sleep there. She made a pallet on the floor near the stove. No, that was not right either. Where did a stranger sleep? She was full of fear. This was a mistake. This was a terrible, terrible mistake. She was bringing a strange man into her house, a man who would own her land, own her boys. What if he was cruel? What if he was a drunkard? The letter said sober, kind, but men lied. Everyone lied. She looked at herself in the small, cracked piece of mirror by the door. Her face was thin, her eyes wide and haunted. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She was not a prize. She was a tired, desperate woman with a burned-out farm and 2 mouths to feed. She baked bread. The smell of it filled the cabin. A good, wholesome smell that fought back against her fear. She made a pot of thin stew, stretching the salt pork with beans and potatoes. As the sun began to sink, turning the sky a bruised purple, she sent the boys to their cot. "Go to sleep," she said. "But it ain't dark, Ma," Jacob complained. "Do as I say. Get under the blankets and close your eyes." They obeyed, sensing the strange, sharp energy coming off her. Eleanor sat at the table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She waited. She listened. The only sound was the wind, howling around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, mournful sound. Then she heard it, the rumble of the stage. It was late. The stage was not supposed to come this way, not this far off the main road, but it was stopping. She heard the jangle of the harness, the curse of the driver. She stood up. Her legs felt weak. She went to the door, her hand on the wooden bolt. A man's voice called out, "Mrs. Briggs, got a passenger for you." She took a deep breath, said a small, broken prayer, and opened the door. The driver was already back on his seat, anxious to get moving. A figure was climbing down from the coach. He moved slowly, stiffly. He stood in the yard, a single carpet bag in his hand. The driver cracked his whip, and the stagecoach lurched away, its lanterns disappearing into the dusk, leaving the man alone in the growing dark. He was tall, but he was stooped. He wore a dark hat, pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He started to walk toward the cabin, and she saw him limp, favoring his left leg. He stopped a few feet from the porch light. He did not look like the kind of man who would answer a letter from a Chicago agency. He looked hard. His clothes were worn, not with farm work, but with hard travel. His face, what she could see of it, was thin and covered in a dark stubble. His eyes were cold, like chipped stone, "Mrs. Briggs?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "I am," she said. She held the doorframe, trying to stop her hands from shaking. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He just looked at her, then past her, into the warm light of the cabin. "You're Arthur Waits," she said. It was not a question. It was a plea. Please be him. The man was silent for a long moment. He looked at the burned-out barn, a black skeleton against the purple sky. He looked at the small, lonely cabin. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas Reddick said. "I'm the man you sent for." Eleanor stared at him. Everything in her screamed that this was wrong. This was not a farmer. This was not a kind man. His hands, gripping the bag, were calloused. Yes, but there was a stillness to him, a watchfulness. It was the stillness of a wolf, not a sheepdog. She could smell the whiskey on him, faint and something else, something metallic like old blood. He was wounded. He was dangerous. Her mind screamed, "Bolt the door! Tell him to go! Get your rifle!" But she looked past him, at the dark, empty prairie. She heard the wind, which sounded like a woman crying. She thought of the snow that was coming, the snow that would bury them. She thought of her 2 boys, pretending to be asleep inside. She was so tired, so very, very tired of being alone. "Well," she said, her voice small, "come in out of the cold. The stew is on." She stepped back, holding the door open. Thomas Reddick looked at her, his eyes unreadable in the shadow of his hat. He limped past her, over the threshold, and into her home. He brought the cold in with him. He did not take off his hat. He stood in the middle of the small room, his presence sucking all the air out of it. The boys peeked at him from under their quilt, their eyes wide. "You can put your bag there," Eleanor said, pointing to a corner. He nodded. He put the bag down. "The stew is hot," she said, moving to the stove. Her hands were shaking so badly she spilled a little on the floor. She ladled a bowl full and put it on the table. He sat. He did not remove his coat. He just sat and stared at the bowl. Then he picked up the spoon and began to eat, slow and steady, like a man who had not seen food in days. Eleanor did not eat. She stood by the stove, watching him. "The boys are asleep," she whispered. He grunted, not looking up. The silence was terrible. It was thick and heavy, and full of all the things they were not saying. When he was finished, he pushed the bowl away. He looked at her. "Where do I sleep?" Eleanor's breath caught. The shame was back, hot and sharp. I thought the barn, there is a loft. It is dry. The roof is still good on the small stable, the part the fire didn't take. I put fresh straw down." She had not. She was lying. She had not thought he would be like this. She had expected a man who would sleep in her bed. This man. She wanted him as far away as possible. He just nodded. "The barn is fine." He stood up, his body stiff. He picked up his bag. "I'll fetch you a lantern," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't need one." He walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the latch. "You've got a rifle, ma'am?" "Yes, Josiah's." "Keep it loaded, and keep it near." He did not look at her. He just set it to the door. "Why?" she whispered. "Wyoming." That was all he said. He opened the door and stepped out into the blackness. Eleanor shut the door. Bolting it fast, she leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She listened. She heard his limping steps cross the yard, heard the creak of the stable door. She went to the window and looked out. There was no light. He was in there, in the dark, in her barn, with his cold eyes and his limp. She went to her own bed, the one she had not been able to offer him. She did not undress. She just pulled the quilt over her, shivering, though the stove was still warm. She listened to the wind howl. It was louder now, sharp and high, promising snow. It was the only sound for miles. That and the pounding of her own blood in her ears. What have I done, she thought. What have I brought into my home? She had sent for a man to save her, but the man who was sleeping in her barn, a few 100 feet from her children, felt like the end of the world. She wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, or if, maybe, she just had no other choice at all. The first morning, the air in the cabin was stretched thin. Eleanor had been awake all night, listening. She had heard nothing from the barn. No coughing, no movement, just the wind. She told herself he was gone, that he had seen the ruin of the place and kept walking. She felt a sharp, confusing mix of relief and failure. But when she opened the door to fetch water, he was there. He was standing by the half-burned fence line, just staring out at the gray land, his back to her. He still wore his hat. He turned when he heard the door creak. He looked tired, more than tired. He looked worn down to the nub. "I'm making coffee. Mr. Waits," she said. Her voice was too loud in the quiet. He just nodded and limped toward the woodpile. He picked up Josiah's axe. It was a heavy, double-bit axe, and Josiah had kept it sharp. Thomas, she had to call him Arthur, swung it. The blade hit the log with a dull thunk and stuck. He was all wrong. He put his shoulders into it, but his feet were in the wrong place, and he was favoring his left side, trying to do all the work with his right arm. It was painful to watch. Samuel came to stand by the door, watching, too. "That's not how Pa did it," he whispered to Eleanor. "Hush," she said, pulling him inside. Thomas worked for an hour. He managed to split 4, maybe 5 pieces of wood, and they were jagged and ugly. He was breathing hard, a sheen of sweat on his face, even in the cold, and he was paler than he had been when he arrived. He stacked the few pieces by the door and went back to the barn without a word. He did not come in for coffee. The next few days were a strange, silent dance. He would appear in the morning, and he would work. He was strong, she could see that, but he was no farmer. He tried to patch the fence where the fire had licked at it. He held the hammer fine, driving nails with a quick, brutal economy of motion. But when he tried to stretch the new wire, he fumbled, cutting his hands until they bled. He never cursed, though. He would just stop, look at the wire like it was a personal enemy, and then try again. He ate what she put in front of him, which was not much: thin stew, biscuits, coffee. He ate silently, his eyes on his plate. He slept in the barn. Eleanor would see the flicker of a small lantern up in the loft, and then it would go out, and she would be alone in the cabin with the sound of her sleeping boys. She tried to talk to him. She had to. This silence was eating her alive. "Mr. Waits," she said one afternoon, as he was trying to rehang the broken gate to the small corral. "Where did you farm before this?" He did not stop working. He set a hinge and measured it with his eye. "South," he said. "South where?" she pushed, trying to keep her voice neighborly. "Texas, for a time. Arizona." "That's cattle country, mostly, not farming." He shrugged, his shoulders stiff. "Land's land. This is hard land. It freezes deep." He finally stopped and looked at her. His eyes were that same chipped stone gray, and they made her feel cold. "It's all hard land, ma'am." He turned back to the gate. The conversation was over. He was a stone wall. He offered nothing about his past, no stories, no family. He never spoke of Chicago, or the agency, or why he had chosen to answer her letter. He was just there, a dark, quiet presence that was supposed to be her husband. Her suspicion grew into a hard knot in her stomach. He wore his coat all the time, even when he was inside, taking a quick meal. He hid his limp as best he could, but she saw him wince when he thought she was not looking. And he wore his gun. It was always on him. A heavy revolver holstered low on his hip. Farmers did not wear guns to mend fences. Not like that. Josiah had owned a gun, but it lived on the wall. This man's gun looked like it was part of his arm. But then something else started to happen. Something that scared her even more than the suspicion. She found herself watching him. She watched him from the cabin window while she kneaded bread. She saw the way he stood, not relaxed, but poised, always watching the horizon, as if he was expecting riders. She watched the set of his jaw, the hard lines of his face. He was not a soft man, not like Josiah had been. There was nothing soft about him. He was all angles and quiet danger, and a part of her, a part she had thought was dead and buried with her husband, felt a small, tight pull. It was not love. It was not even fondness. It was a raw, aching curiosity. It was the fact that he was alive and male, and in her yard. It was the simple, desperate fact of his presence. He was a wall against the emptiness, even if he was a dangerous one. She hated herself for it. She felt disloyal. She felt cheap. The boys were the first to break the silence. Jacob, the youngest, stayed clear of him. He hid behind Eleanor's skirts when the man limped by. But Samuel, her quiet, watchful son, was drawn to him. Samuel had taken the loss of his father hard, retreating into a little shell of manhood, trying to be the man of the house, failing, and knowing it. He was 8 years old and carried the weight of the world. One evening, after the sun had gone down, Eleanor saw Samuel slip out of the cabin and go to the barn. Her heart flew into her throat. She grabbed her shawl, ready to run after him, to pull him away from that man. She stopped at the cabin door. The barn door was open a crack. She could see them inside, in the small, dry part of the stall that had survived. Thomas was sitting on an overturned bucket. Samuel was sitting on the ground a few feet away. Thomas had a piece of firewood in one hand and a long, sharp-looking knife in the other. He was whittling. His hands, which were so clumsy with wire, moved with a strange, fluid grace. He was carving something. Curls of pine fell to the dirt floor. Samuel was just watching, his chin in his hands, completely silent. Eleanor watched them for 10 minutes. Neither of them said a word. Thomas just carved, and Samuel just watched. It was the most peaceful she had seen her son since the fire. She backed away from the door, her mind reeling. Later that night, Samuel came in. He did not say where he had been. He just went to his cot, but as he climbed under the blanket, he placed a small, rough-looking wooden bird on the shelf above his bed. After that, it became a ritual. Samuel would do his chores, and then he would go sit with Thomas in the barn for an hour before dark. They rarely spoke, but Eleanor would see Thomas hand him the knife, guiding his small hands on a piece of soft wood. "He's teaching me," Samuel told her once, his eyes bright. It was the first time she had seen him excited about anything in months. Her confusion deepened. What kind of man was this? A gunman who was clumsy with a plow, but gentle enough to teach a grieving boy how to carve a bird. A liar who slept in her barn, but who did not so much as look at her with anything other than that cold, respectful distance. He was a contradiction. He was a danger, and he was, somehow, a comfort. The two feelings warred inside her, leaving her exhausted. Then the first real storm hit. It came on fast, a white wall that erased the world. The wind did not howl. It screamed. It clawed at the little cabin, rattling the windows, trying to find a way in. Snow piled in drifts against the door, and the air grew so cold it hurt to breathe. Eleanor and the boys were huddled around the stove. She had been up for 2 days, keeping the fire roaring, terrified it would go out. They were running low on the wood Thomas had chopped. On the second night of the storm, she was dozing in her chair, the rifle on her lap. The boys were asleep, tangled together for warmth on their cot. A sound jolted her awake. It was not the wind. It was a crack, a sharp, splintering sound, followed by a heavy thump, and then a strange, scraping noise. It came from outside. Her first thought was the ranchers. They had come back. They had come to finish the job in the middle of the blizzard. Her second thought was Thomas. She went to the window. rubbing a clear spot on the frozen pane. She could see nothing. It was a swirling, churning vortex of white. She pulled on Josiah's heavy coat, grabbed the rifle, and unbarred the door. The wind tore it from her hand, slamming it open against the cabin wall. Snow blasted in, stinging her face. "Mister, wait!" she yelled into the white. "Thomas!" She used his real name, the one he had never answered to. No reply, just the shriek of the wind. She pulled the door shut, her heart pounding. Something was wrong. She lit the heavy lantern, though she knew the wind would likely tear the flame out. She had to go. She could not leave him out there. He was a man, and it was her land, and he was, for all his lies, under her protection. She wrapped her scarf over her face, leaving only her eyes, and opened the door again. She stepped out into the blizzard. It was like walking into a solid wall. The snow was up to her knees. The wind knocked her off balance. She held the lantern high, but its light only lit up the wall of falling snow a few feet in front of her. "Wait!" she screamed again. She fought her way toward the barn. The scraping sound was louder now. It was coming from near the water trough. They kept a small, smoky fire dug in under the trough to keep a small part of it from freezing solid. She saw him. He was on his knees. He had no shirt on. His back was bare, glistening with snow and sweat. The wind was whipping his hair across his face. He was hunched over the trough, breaking the ice with his fist, then splashing the freezing water onto his side. "Dear God in heaven!" Eleanor cried. She ran, stumbling through the drifts, and grabbed his arm. "What are you doing? Are you mad? You'll die!" His skin was like ice, but his face was burning. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were not his own. They were glassy, wild with fever. He was covered in blood. The bandage he always wore under his shirt was gone. He had a fresh one, a piece of torn sheet, and it was soaked through with dark, black-looking blood. He had been washing it in the trough. "Got to get it clean," he slurred. He was swaying. "It's burning." "You're burning!" she screamed. "You have a fever! You have to come inside!" She pulled on his arm. He tried to stand, but his legs were made of string. He pushed himself up, leaned on her, and then his full weight came down. He collapsed. He went down into the snowdrift by the trough, a dead weight, and did not move. "Thomas!" she shrieked. She dropped the lantern. It hissed and died in the snow, plunging them into a swirling darkness, lit only by the white of the snow itself. "No," she whimpered. "No, you will not die. I will not bury another man." She grabbed him under the arms. He was heavy, a solid, dead weight of muscle and bone. She was not a weak woman, but the snow, the wind, and the dead weight of him were too much. She put her back into it. She dragged him. She dug her heels into the snow and pulled, backwards, toward the light of the cabin door. Every step was a battle. The wind tried to push her over. The snow tried to steal her feet. His boots caught on every drift. She fell. She got up. She pulled again. She was sobbing, the tears freezing on her cheeks. "Come on, you devil!" she gritted, pulling him over the threshold. "Come on." She fell into the cabin with him, his legs tangled with hers. She slammed the door shut against the storm and bolted it. For a full minute, she lay on the floor, panting, her lungs on fire. The boys were sitting bolt upright in their cot, their eyes wide with terror. "It's all right," Eleanor panted, pulling herself up. "Go back to sleep. It's the storm." She looked at the man on her floor. He was unconscious, his skin a deathly gray, his lips blue. Snow was melting off him, pooling on the packed earth. "Samuel," she said, her voice sharp. "Get me the blankets. All of them." She dragged him, scraping him across the floor, until he was close to the stove. His skin was so cold it felt like it was burning her hands. "Get his boots. Samuel." Samuel, his face pale but his hands steady, knelt and tugged at the heavy, frozen boots, finally pulling them free. "Go back to bed," "Cover your heads. Do not look," she commanded. The boys dove under the quilt. Eleanor was alone with him. She had to get the wet clothes off him, or the cold would kill him before the fever did. Her hands were shaking. This was a strange man. Her husband, her outlaw. She unbuckled his gun belt, her fingers fumbling with the cold metal. She laid the heavy gun on the table, far from the stove. She unbuttoned his soaked trousers. She pulled them down, her face burning with shame, trying not to look at him as anything but a problem to be solved, a body to be saved. She got them off, and his wet drawers, until he was lying naked on her floor. She threw a blanket over him, quick, and then got to work. She took the lantern from the table and held it close. The wound, which he had hidden for weeks, was finally bare. It was worse than she could have imagined. His left side, from his ribs down to his hip, was a swollen, purple mass of infected flesh. In the center of it was a ragged, puckered hole. It was deep. It was black at the edges. She had seen a wound like this once before, on a man in town who had shot himself in the leg cleaning his rifle. This was a gunshot. All the air left her lungs. The suspicion, the fear, the vague attraction. It all curdled into cold, hard certainty. This was not Arthur Waits. This was not a farmer. This was a man who had been shot. Rage, cold and pure, washed over her. He had brought this to her. He had brought his violence, his lies, and his death to her door, to her children. She went to the stove and grabbed the whiskey bottle she kept for snakebite, and a clean rag. She went back to him. He was shivering, his teeth chattering. She knelt beside him. "Who did this to you?" she demanded, her voice a low, vicious hiss. "Who shot you?" He did not answer. He was lost in the fever. "You tell me," she said, grabbing his shoulder. He moaned, his head tossing on the floor. "You brought this here," she whispered, her anger breaking into fear. She poured the whiskey onto the rag. She pressed it, hard, into the open, infected wound. He screamed. It was not a mumble. It was a raw, animal sound of pure agony. His back arched off the floor, his hands clawing at the blankets. "Hold still," she ordered, crying now. "Hold still, or it will kill you." His eyes flew open. They were black with fever and pain, and they saw nothing. "Cards," he gasped, his body rigid. He drew stupid. Bad blood, bad blood." He fell back, unconscious again, his breathing shallow. She cleaned it. She cleaned it all, her stomach churning, the smell of whiskey and sick flesh filling the small cabin. She washed the blood from his skin, her hands moving with a rough tenderness. She saw the other scars on his body, an old knife wound on his arm, a pale, puckered scar on his thigh. This was a man who had lived a hard, violent life. When she was done, she packed the wound with the last of her yarrow and comfrey, a poultice to draw the fever, though she knew it was probably useless. She bandaged him with clean strips torn from a bedsheet. She covered him with every blanket she owned. She stoked the fire until the stove was roaring hot. Then she sat on the floor, her back against the wall, the rifle across her knees. She watched him. The storm howled outside. Inside, there was only the sound of his breathing, shallow and fast, and the crackle of the fire. She looked at him, wrapped in her blankets, helpless, sweating, on her floor. The disgust was still there. He was a liar. He was, mostly likely, a killer, a man who got shot over a card game. But the revulsion was mixed with something else, a sharp, painful pity. He was just a man, after all, and he was alone as she was. He had come to her, bleeding and desperate, and lied to her. Yes, but he had also chopped her wood. He had sat with her son. He had not hurt them. He had just been... And beneath the pity, beneath the anger, was her own loneliness. It was a physical ache, a hollowness that had been sitting in her chest for months. This man, this broken, dangerous man, was the first real warmth that had come into her house since Josiah died. It was a terrible, ugly warmth. But it was there. It felt hot and painful, like a wound of her own. He moaned again. He was so pale. His dark stubble stark against the waxy skin. His chest rose and fell. She found herself staring at his chest. The blanket had slipped, revealing the pale skin, the dark hair. She saw the steady, faint beat of his heart under the ribs. She did not know why she did it. It was a moment of weakness, a moment where the storm, the fear, and the crushing loneliness all came together. She leaned close. She could smell the fever on him, a sour, metallic smell. She reached out one trembling hand. She just wanted to touch him, to feel that he was alive. She laid her fingers lightly on his chest, just over his heart. His skin was hot, damp with fever, but beneath it she felt the steady, thudding rhythm of his life. Thud, thump, thud, thump. It was the most real thing she had felt in months. His eyes snapped open. Eleanor froze. Her hand was still on his chest. He was not delirious now. He was awake. His eyes were clear, sharp, and terrifyingly lucid. They were fixed on her. He did not speak. He did not move. He did not even seem to breathe. He just watched her, his gaze intense, unblinking. A wave of shame so hot it made her dizzy washed over Eleanor. She felt caught. She felt naked. She snatched her hand back like she had touched the hot stove. She scrambled to her feet, her face burning. She could not look at him. She turned her back, grabbed her own quilt, and fled to her cold bed on the other side of the room, leaving him alone by the fire. The morning after she had touched him, the world was trapped. The storm had not broken. It raged. A howling white wall outside the cabin, locking them in. Eleanor woke on her cot, cold and stiff, her whole body humming with shame. She had fled to her bed, but sleep had not come. She had lain there, listening to his breathing by the stove, every rasp a reminder of her weakness. She sat up. He was awake. He was always awake before her. It seemed he was lying on the pallet, staring at the ceiling, his face pale and slick with a new sweat. The fever was still on him. She got up, her back to him. She could not look at him. She felt the heat in her own face, a flush that had nothing to do with the stove. She went to the water basin, her movements jerky. "The fever's high," he said. His voice, a dry rasp, made her flinch. It was the first thing he had said since his eyes opened and found her hand on his chest. "I see that," she said, her voice clipped. She had to tend the wound again. The thought of it made her stomach clench. He was awake this time. He was lucid. She stoked the fire, boiled water, got the clean rags. She knelt beside him. "You need to sit up, if you can." He used his good arm to push himself up against the wall, his jaw tight. He did not wince, but a line of white appeared around his mouth. He pulled the blanket away, exposing the crude bandage she had wrapped around his torso. Her hands trembled. She felt clumsy, foolish. This was not like tending Josiah or the boys. This was a stranger whose skin she had touched in the dark, whose life she had felt beating. She began to unwrap the bandage. He was watching her face. She focused on the task, her movements rough, clinical. "You're a liar," she said, her voice low. She did not look at his face, only at the angry, swollen wound. He did not answer. He just breathed, slow and steady, as she peeled the last layer of cloth from the raw flesh. "This is a gunshot," she said. "Yes," he said. Arthur Waits was not a man who got shot. "No, ma'am, I reckon he wasn't." The quiet admission, the simple truth of it, made her angrier than a lie would have. She dipped the cloth in the hot water and whiskey, and she pressed it to the wound. He hissed, his whole body going rigid, his hands clenching into fists on the blanket, but he made no other sound. She cleaned it. She worked with a silent, contained fury. He had brought this here, this violence, this lie, and he had seen her. He had seen her desperation. When she was done, she wrapped a fresh bandage, pulling it tight. "I should throw you out," she said, tying the knot. "I should tell the boys you died in the storm. I should let the snow have you." "Why don't you?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked at him then. His eyes were clear, the fever haze gone, replaced by that cold, watchful gray. He was not afraid of her. He was not afraid of dying. She stood up, her whole body shaking. "Because my boys are watching," she whispered, "and because I am not a murderer." She left him by the fire and went to make bread, kneading the dough with a violence that left her breathless. The storm lasted 2 more days. For 2 days, they were trapped in that small, single room. The air was thick with unspoken things. It was thick with the smell of the fever, the whiskey, the boiling coffee, and the fear. The boys, sensing the terrible tension, were quiet. They played a game with pebbles on the floor, their voices small. Thomas, she could not think of him as Arthur anymore, did not speak again. He lay on the pallet, healing. He had a constitution that was inhuman. He was like a coyote, tough and hard to kill. The fever broke on the 3rd night. The angry purple of the wound began to fade. He was healing. When the storm finally passed, the world outside was a silent, white desert. The sun was a pale, cold disk. He got up. He was weak, his legs shaky, but he stood. He pulled on the clothes she had washed and mended. He picked up his hat. "I'll go to the barn," he said. "You will not," she said, not turning from the stove. She had her back to him, but she could feel him watching her. "I can't stay in here, ma'am." "And you can't stay out there. You'll freeze to death, or the wound will open up. I won't have it." "Then what?" She turned. "You'll sleep here, on the pallet, until you are strong enough to work. You came here to work, so you will work. You will fix what's broken." He looked at her, a long, assessing gaze. He was trying to figure her out. She was trying to figure herself out. She was giving him an order. She was letting him stay. He nodded once, a sharp, small movement. He put his hat back on the peg. And so he stayed in the cabin. The pallet by the stove became the house, which had felt so empty and cold after Josiah died, now felt impossibly small. It was full of him, his long legs, his quietness, his shadow. As his strength returned, he began to work. He was, as she had first guessed, no farmer, but he was a fixer. He had good hands. He braced the wall where the wind had pushed it. He rechinked the logs, mixing mud and straw with a grim patience, stopping the drafts that had plagued them. He fixed the cabin door so it shut tight and true, no longer rattling in the wind. He worked without being asked. He would just see a thing that was broken, and he would fix it. He spent an afternoon repairing the harness, his fingers surprisingly nimble with the leather and the awl. They fell into a routine. It was a strange domestic life, built on a foundation of lies and silence. They ate together. Eleanor sat at one end of the table, he at the other. The boy sat between them. The charged silence was constant. It was heavy with the memory of the storm, of her hand on his chest, of the gunshot wound. He knew she knew he was a lie. She knew he knew she'd been lonely enough to touch him. They orbited this knowledge. She would catch him watching her. She would be washing the tin plates, her back to the room, and she would feel his gaze on her. It was not a cold look. Not anymore. It was watchful, curious. It made the small hairs on the back of her neck stand up. And the boys, they changed. Jacob, the little one, was still shy, but he stopped hiding. He would roll a pebble toward the man's pallet, and Thomas, without looking up from his mending, would roll it back. Samuel blossomed. The man taught him. In the evenings, by the fire, he would show Samuel how to use the knife, not just to carve, but to fix, how to splice a rope, how to sharpen the axe blade until it sang. He spoke to Samuel in a low, quiet voice, and her son, who had been silent for months, started to talk again. "He says I got a good eye for it, Ma," Samuel said one night, his face bright, holding up a small, perfectly jointed wooden trap. "He says we can catch rabbits." Thomas never spoke of his past, and she never asked. They did not speak of the man named Arthur Waits. They did not speak of the gunshot. He was just Mr. Waits to the boys, and nothing at all to her. Then the world turned white again. Another blizzard, worse than the ones before, blew down from the mountains. It came with a vengeance, burying the cabin up to the windows, sealing them in. The wind did not howl. It screamed, a high, thin sound like a woman in pain. For days, they were trapped. They fed the fire, ate their dwindling stores, and listened to the storm try to tear the roof off. On the third night of it, the cabin was dark. The boys were long asleep in their cot, a tangle of blankets. The only light was the red, flickering glow from the stove's grate. The wind was so loud it felt like it was inside the room. Eleanor was mending a tear in Samuel's coat by the weak firelight, her fingers numb. Thomas was sitting at the table, his chair tilted back against the wall. He was just staring at the fire, lost in thought. He had been quiet for hours. The quiet, save for the wind, stretched on. "Why'd you do it?" His voice was so low, so rough. She thought she had imagined it. She stopped sewing. "Do what?" "Send for a man." He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the fire. "Send for a stranger, to a place like this." He gestured, a small movement of his head, at the small, dark room. The howling wind. "This ain't a place to invite someone. This is a place to run from." Eleanor put the coat down in her lap. The question was a sharp, hard thing. But the storm, the darkness, the isolation, it pulled the truth out of her, like a bad tooth. "My husband, Josiah," she said, her voice quiet. "He was a good man. He was kind. He built this cabin with his own hands. He loved this land." She stared at her own hands, chapped and red. When the ranchers came, the ones who burned the barn, he went out to stop them. He was a farmer. He wasn't a fighter. He died trying to be brave, and it was just a waste. She looked up, at the dark logs of the wall. "I have no family back east to go to. The other widows in town, they go to work in the saloons, washing floors, or other things. I can't, not with my boys." She finally looked at him. His face was half in shadow, but his eyes were on her. They were steady. "I wasn't looking for love, Mr. Whoever you are." The admission came out, tasting like rust and shame. "I wasn't even looking for a kind man. I was looking for a wall. I was looking for a man who could hold a rifle and not shake. Someone who could face those men and not break." She took a shaky breath, the confession tearing out of her. "I didn't need someone gentle. I needed someone who wouldn't die." The wind shrieked, filling the silence that followed. Thomas looked down at his own hands, resting on his knees. They were scarred, the knuckles heavy. He unconsciously touched his side, where the wound was, a thick, raised scar beneath his shirt. "Then I came to the right place," he said. His voice was a bare whisper. It was not a boast. It was not a joke. It was the simplest, hardest truth. It was an admission. He was not gentle, and he was a man who wouldn't die, even when he was shot. Their eyes met and held. In that look, something shattered. The fear, the suspicion, the awkwardness, the shame. It all burned away, like fog in a hard sun. All that was left was the two of them, in that cabin, in the middle of a storm, at the edge of the world. Two survivors. She did not know she was moving. She just was. She stood up, the coat falling to the floor. She walked the few steps to where he sat. He watched her come. He did not move, his chair still tilted against the wall. He just watched her face. She stopped in front of him, her hand, of its own accord, lifted. She was shaking. She reached out and brushed her fingers, lightly, across the scarred knuckles of his hand. His skin was rough and very warm. He did not pull away. He did not move at all. It was not a thought. It was a wave. It was the loneliness of the grave, the cold of the winter, the terror of the ranchers, and the strange, hot pull she had felt for this broken, dangerous man. It all crested, and it all broke. She leaned down. She put her hand on his shoulder to steady herself, and she kissed him. It was not a soft kiss. It was sudden, and it was desperate. It was clumsy. It was a kiss of pure hunger, of a woman who had been cold for so long she thought she had frozen solid. His lips were chapped, and he tasted of coffee and the faint, metallic tang of his own blood. For 1 second, he was completely still. He was a block of iron, rigid with surprise. Then, as she began to pull away, her face burning with what she had done, his hand came up. He did not grab her. He just cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the bun of her hair. He held her there, and he kissed her back. It was not a gentle kiss either. It was hard, and it was certain. It was an answer. It was a matching desperation that took her breath, that made her knees weak. She pulled back, breathing hard. "Thomas," she whispered, using the name the marshal had spoken. He stood up. He didn't let go of her. His chair scraped the floor, loud. He was tall, and he filled the small space in front of her. His eyes were dark, all the coldness gone, burned away by something raw and immediate. She should have been terrified. This was the man from her darkest fears, the outlaw, the killer. She was just finished. She was finished being alone. She did not say a word. She just turned, walked the 3 steps to her own bed, Josiah's bed, and pulled back the quilt. It was an invitation. It was a surrender. She heard his boots on the earth floor. He stopped beside the bed. She heard the sound, loud in the small room, of his gun belt being unbuckled. He laid it on the table. He blew out the lantern. The room was plunged into darkness, lit only by the faint, red heartbeat of the stove. He took his boots off. She heard them drop, one by one. The bed sagged as he got in beside her. They lay side by side, in the dark, not touching. They were 2 rigid lines, stiff with the awful, sudden reality of it. The bed was small. His shoulder was a solid wall of heat, inches from hers. The wind screamed, a counterpoint to the wild pounding of her own heart. After a long time, a time that felt like a year, she turned onto her side, facing him. He turned, too. She could not see his face, only his shape. And then they were just holding on. It was not tender. It was not soft. It was like 2 drowning people finding the same piece of wood in a black, raging sea. It was a tangle of limbs and cold feet and rough hands. His hand was in her hair. Her hands were fisted in his shirt. Holding on. Holding on. It was silent. There were no words. There was just the desperate, animal need for warmth, for contact, for another living, breathing body in the dark. When it was over, when the world outside the cabin rushed back in, the full, crushing weight of what she had done fell on her. This was Josiah's bed. This was a stranger, a liar, a man with blood on his hands. A single, hot tear escaped her eye. Then another. She turned away from him, pulling her knees to her chest, curling into a tight, miserable ball. Her shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. She cried for her dead husband. She cried for her own awful, aching loneliness. She cried because she was so ashamed and so scared. She waited for him to get up, to dress, to go back to his pallet by the fire, to leave her alone with her shame. He did not move. Instead, she felt the bed shift. A heavy, warm arm came around her waist. He pulled her back against his chest. His body was a solid, living wall of heat. He did not pat her. He did not whisper that it was all right. He said nothing. He just held her. He held her tight, as if he was anchoring her to the earth, stopping her from flying apart. He held her while she cried, and he held her long after the sobs quieted. And in the dark, with the storm screaming and a killer's arm around her, Eleanor Briggs finally fell asleep. She woke to a bright, painful silence. The storm had passed. The cabin was full of a cold, blue light. She was alone in the bed. She sat up, her heart pounding. He was gone. Then she saw him. He was at the stove, his back to her. He was wearing his trousers and his shirt, his feet bare on the cold floor. He was making coffee. The pallet by the stove was gone. The blankets were neatly folded on the chair. Her face burned. She felt raw, exposed. She could not look at him. She got out of bed, her own clothes rumpled. She smoothed her dress, her hands shaking. She went to the water basin, keeping her back to him, and splashed icy water on her face. She heard him move. He set a tin mug of coffee on the table. "Boys are still asleep," he said. His voice was the same low, rough rasp, but it was different. Everything was different. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. She sat at the table. She stared into the black coffee. He sat opposite her, with his own mug. The silence stretched, but it was not the cold, suspicious silence of before. It was not the charged, electric silence of the last few weeks. It was softer. It was less guarded. They had seen the worst of each other, the desperation, the vulnerability. There were no more pretenses. He pushed a small object across the table. It slid to a stop next to her mug. She looked down. It was a dog, carved from a piece of pine, no bigger than her thumb. It was perfect. The head was cocked, the ears alert, the small body tense, as if it was about to run. "It's for Jacob," he said, not looking at her. He likes dogs." She picked it up. The wood was smooth, still warm. She looked at him. She really looked at him. In the clear, cold light of morning. His eyes met hers. He was not ashamed. He was not triumphant. He was just watching her. Waiting. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Something between them had settled. She did not know what it was. It was not love. It was not trust. But it was something. He was no longer the stranger. He was the man who was here. Later that week, the weather held. It was a false thaw, a few days of weak sun. Thomas, she called him Thomas in her head now. It was his name, was outside. He was moving better. The wound was a scar. He was trying to repair the roof of the small, surviving part of the barn. Eleanor was hanging laundry. The wet sheets were freezing stiff as she pinned them. Samuel was handing her the wooden pins. That is when she saw the rider. A single man on a strong bay horse, coming from the east. He was not a rancher. He rode with a purpose. He wore a long, dark coat, and as he got closer, she saw the winter sun glint off the badge pinned to his chest. Her blood turned to ice. "Samuel," she said, her voice sharp, quiet. "Go to the barn. Now. Run. Tell Mister. Waits tell him he has a hole in his boot. Tell him he needs to mend it right now. Tell him to stay in the barn, in the loft, until I come for him. Do you understand?" Samuel saw her face. He saw the rider. He dropped the basket of pins and ran. Eleanor stood by the laundry line. She did not run. She did not hide. She just stood there, her hands, still damp, clutching her apron. The lawman rode up and stopped, his horse blowing steam. He was an older man, with a face like tanned leather and a thick gray mustache. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "U.S. Marshal John Harding. Apologies for the intrusion." "Marshal?" She nodded. She was surprised her voice worked. "This is a long way off your usual path." "It is," he said. He looked at the burned-out barn. He looked at the small, poor cabin. He looked at her, a lone woman hanging laundry. His eyes held a flicker of pity, but it was quickly gone, replaced by duty. "I'm on the hunt. Mrs. Briggs, looking for a wanted man." "A lot of those out here," she said, her voice hollow. "This one's particular," Harding said. "Name's Thomas Reddick. He's a killer. Was in a saloon brawl up in Sweetwater a few months back. Killed a man, got shot himself in the process. Badly. We tracked him to the stage line out of Cheyenne, and then he just vanished, like a ghost." Eleanor felt the world tilt. Thomas Reddick shot himself. "We got a rumor," the marshal continued, his eyes scanning the property, "that he might have taken another man's identity, might have been headed this way. He's tall, dark hair, quiet, calloused hands, might be limping." She had to breathe. She forced air into her lungs. There's no one here, Marshal, just me and my 2 sons." The marshal's gaze lingered. It was heavy. "You sure about that, ma'am? A woman alone, a burned-out place. This is the kind of spot a man like Reddick would look for. An easy place to hide. Easy to take advantage of." The lie came. It came out of her before she even thought about it. "I have a farmhand, an old man, Ephraim. He sleeps in town, comes out sometimes to help with the heavy wood, but he's not here today." Marshal Harding stared at her. He stared for a long minute. Eleanor met his gaze. She did not blink. She did not look away. She thought of her boys, asleep in the cabin. She thought of the man in the barn, the man who had held her while she cried, the man who carved tiny, perfect dogs for her son. "I see," Harding said finally. He looked past her, at the small woodshed, a lean-to built against the side of the cabin. "You mind if I check your outbuildings, ma'am, just to be thorough? A man with a bad wound might not make it to the barn, might hole up in the first place he found." "Go ahead," she said, her voice flat. Her heart stopped. She had told Samuel to send him to the barn, but the woodshed was closer. Where had he gone? The marshal dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. He walked, not to the barn, but to the woodshed. Eleanor's hands went cold. She could not breathe. He pulled the rickety door open. It screeched on its leather hinges. It was dark inside. The marshal squinted, peering into the blackness, stacked high with firewood. From where she stood, Eleanor could see. He was there, not in the barn. He was in the woodshed. He was pressed into the back corner, in the deepest shadows, behind the woodpile. He was perfectly, inhumanly still. If the marshal took 2 more steps, he would be on top of him. The marshal grunted. He kicked a loose log, sending it rolling. He saw nothing but shadows and wood. He shut the door. He walked back to his horse. "Well, Mel, apologies again. This is a hard country. You stay safe." "You, too, Marshal," she said. He mounted his horse. He gave her one last, long, unreadable look. Then he turned his horse and rode away, back toward the east. Eleanor did not move. She watched him until he was a tiny black speck on the white prairie. And then, until he was gone. Her legs gave out. She sank to her knees in the snow, the empty laundry basket tipping over. She stayed there, kneeling in the frozen mud, until the sky began to turn a deep, cold purple. She heard the woodshed door creak open. He came out. He did not go to the barn. He walked to where she knelt. He stood over her, a tall, dark shadow against the fading light. She looked up at him. "You heard," she whispered. "Every word," he said. She got to her feet, brushing the snow and ice from her dress. She was shaking, not from the cold. She was shaking with a terror so deep it vibrated in her bones. She walked past him, into the cabin. He followed her. The boys were playing quietly by the stove. They looked up, their faces pale. Eleanor went to the wall. She took down Josiah's rifle. She checked the load. Ma, Samuel said, his voice small.
What's wrong? Who was that man?
Nothing, she said, her voice hard.
Go to bed, both of you.
But Ma, the sun ain't even down.
Now, Samuel!
They scrambled under their quilts, pulling them over their heads, pretending to be asleep. Eleanor turned to Thomas. She did not raise the rifle. She just held it, the stock resting on the floor, her hand on the barrel.
Who is Thomas Reddick?
She asked, her voice flat. He stood by the door. He did not lie. He did not try. He just looked at her. I am, he said. Eleanor walked to the cabin door. She shut it, and she bolted it. She stood there, her back to the door, the rifle in her hands. She listened to the wind, which was picking up again. She listened to the sound of her children, trying to breathe quietly under their blankets. And she listened to the man at her table, the man she had kissed, the man she had slept with, the man she had just lied for, the wanted murderer. He did not move. He just sat in the dark and waited for morning. She was terrified, but as she stood there, gripping the cold steel of the rifle, she realized a strange and awful truth. She was not afraid of him. She was terrified of what she had done. The cabin was dead silent, but it was a loud silence. It was filled with the sound of the boys trying not to breathe under their blankets, the sound of the wind finding the new cracks in the chinking, and the sound of Eleanor's own heart, hammering a dry, cold beat against her ribs. She stood with her back to the bolted door, the rifle held loose in her hands. It was not a threat, not yet. It was a solid, wooden thing to hold on to. Thomas Reddick sat at the table. He had not moved. He just sat there, his hat on the table in front of him, his face carved out of the shadows by the low, red light of the stove. He looked tired, but he did not look scared. That was the thing that twisted in her gut. He did not look scared.
Thomas Reddick,
she said. Her voice was not her own. It was a flat, dead sound.
That's your name.
It is, he said.
And the man in Sweetwater, the one you killed.
He had it coming, Thomas said, his voice just as flat. He was a cheat, and he was loud, and he pulled on me first.
And Arthur Waits?
She asked, the name tasting like ash. The man I sent for, the man whose ticket you used. He was the one who shot me, Thomas said. He looked down at his hands, resting on the table. He pulled his gun when the other man did. He was drunk, I think. His shot went wild. Hit me in the side. He paused. I shot the man who drew on me. Arthur Waits. He bled out on the floor before anyone thought to help him. He was already dead when I took his papers. Eleanor felt sick. The whole story was ugly. A dirty, bloody mess in a saloon. And she had invited it into her home.
So you're a thief,
she said. Yes, ma'am. And a killer. Yes, ma'am. And a liar.
I came here,
he said, finally looking up at her, his eyes unreadable in the gloom. I was gut shot. I had nowhere else to go. I read your letter. I figured a widow on her own. You needed a man to work. I needed a place to heal. I figured it was an even trade. I didn't come here to hurt you.
You didn't come here to hurt me?
Her voice cracked, rising.
You brought a marshal to my door. You had my son hide you. You made me lie to a federal officer. Do you know what they do to people who aid men like you? They burn them out. They take their land. They take their children.
She stepped away from the door, her knuckles white on the rifle.
You put my boys in danger.
The very thing I sent for a man to stop. He's gone, Thomas said quietly. He didn't find me. He won't be back. You don't know that. Men like him, they smell a lie. He'll be back. And what about the men you ran from in Sweetwater, the friends of the man you killed? They don't know where I am.
But you're here,
she cried. A whisper scream. You are here, in my house, in my life. She could not say it.
I slept with you. I trusted you. I felt safe with you. The shame of it was so hot, it choked her.
She lowered the rifle, resting the butt on the floor. The anger, the cold, hard rage that had held her up, suddenly drained away. It left her hollow, and all that rushed in to fill the space was anguish. It was a sharp, cutting pain, worse than the cold. This was the man who had taught her son to carve, the man who had fixed her door, the man whose warm, solid body had held her while she wept in the dark. That man, he was not real. He was a ghost. He was an outlaw named Thomas Reddick, a man who got shot in card games and stole dead men's lives. And she, Eleanor Briggs, was a fool, a desperate, lonely fool who had opened her door, her home, her bed, to him.
I have to ask you a question.
Thomas, she said, her voice trembling. He just waited. Are you a dangerous man? He looked at her. He seemed to turn the question over in his mind, testing its weight. He looked at the boys, hidden under their quilt. He looked at her, at the rifle, at her shaking hands. Yes, he said, I am. Her heart stopped. But not to you, he continued, his voice low. Not to them. He nodded at the cot. I'm only dangerous to men who try to own me, or men who try to hurt folks who can't fight back. She stared at him, the tears finally coming, hot and fast, blurring the sight of him. He was a killer, and he was, in his own broken, terrible way, an honest one. He had told her the truth, and she believed him. That was the worst part. She believed him. But it did not matter.
You have to go,
she whispered. He did not seem surprised. He just watched her.
You have to leave, now, tonight.
Ma'am, there's another storm coming in. The wind's already turned.
I don't care,
she said, the tears streaming down her face. She wiped them away with a savage hand.
I don't care if it's the end of the world. You brought this here. You cannot stay. I have to think of my sons. I will not have them raised by a man with a price on his head. I will not have them watch me get dragged away for harboring you.
She pointed to the door.
Get your things, and go.
He was silent for a long time. He looked at the stove, at the small, warm room that had been his refuge. He looked at the cot where the boys were pretending to be asleep. Then he stood up. He was just a tall shadow. He walked to the peg and took down his worn coat. He picked up his hat from the table. He went to the corner and picked up his carpet bag. He did not argue. He did not beg. He did not even look at her again. He walked to the door. He unbolted it. A blast of ice-cold air filled the room, making the lantern flame gutter. The wind was already screaming.
Thomas,
she whispered, her voice breaking. He stopped, his hand on the door, his back to her.
She wanted to say something. I'm sorry. Be safe. Don't die. But she could not. She was the one sending him out.
Go, she said. He stepped out. He pulled the door shut behind him. The latch clicked. The bolt was on his side. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, shaking so hard she had to sit down. She put her head in her hands and she wept. She wept for Josiah, for herself, for the man walking out into the storm. She wept for the terrible, impossible choice she had just made. A few minutes later, the boys crawled out from their cot. They came and stood by her chair, their small faces crumpled with confusion and fear.
Ma? Samuel whispered. Where did he go?
He had to leave. Samuel. But he didn't say goodbye.
Where did Pa go?
Jacob, the little one, asked. His voice was thick with sleep. He had called him Pa. Eleanor looked at her son, and her heart, which she thought was already broken, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He's not your pa, Jacob. He was just a man who was helping. But he was teaching me, Samuel said, his own eyes filling with tears. He said we'd catch rabbits. Go back to bed, Eleanor said, her voice rough.
Is he coming back?
Samuel pushed.
No, she said.
He's not coming back." The boys started to cry. Not loud, but with the high, thin sobs of children who had lost something they had only just found. Eleanor pulled them close, one in each arm. She held them, rocking, while the wind hammered at the cabin, and the snow began to hiss against the windows. She did not sleep after the boys had cried themselves to sleep at her feet. She put them back in their cot. She went to the window. She rubbed a spot clear and stared out into the swirling black and white chaos. She watched all night. She watched for a shadow, for a man stumbling back, for anything. There was nothing, just the storm. She had told him to go, and he had gone. He had walked out into a blizzard, a man who had just healed from a gunshot, to save her from the trouble he had brought. She had needed someone who wouldn't die, and she had just sent him out to do exactly that. The morning was blinding. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured and buried. The snow was piled in drifts as high as the cabin roof. It was beautiful, and it was empty. A clean, white grave. Eleanor put on her coat and boots, her movements slow, her body aching with cold and grief. She had to check the stable, what was left of it. She had to see if the snow had broken the roof. She opened the door. The snow was packed hard against it. She had to shove, putting her shoulder into it. She stopped. There, on the porch, half buried in a drift but protected by the small overhang, was his coat, the one he had been wearing. It was folded, neat and square. She stared at it. He had left without his coat. In that storm, he had left his warmest thing. She reached down, her fingers trembling, and picked it up. It was heavy, still holding a faint, residual warmth. Or maybe that was just her imagination. Underneath it, where the coat had been, was a small, heavy leather pouch, a drawstring pouch. She picked it up. It clinked. She pulled the string. Inside, her hands shaking, she poured the contents into her palm. Coins, silver dollars, and a few gold pieces. It was a lot of money, more than she had seen in her entire life. It was the money from the card game, the money he had taken from Arthur Waits. He had left it. He had left her his coat and his money, and walked out into a blizzard to die. Eleanor sank onto the porch step, the coins cold in her hand, his coat in her lap. She looked out at the vast, white, empty world. There were no tracks. The wind had wiped them all away. He was gone. He had traded his life, it seemed, for the lie she had told. The days that followed were the quietest of her life. The money sat in the pouch, hidden under her mattress. The coat. She could not bring herself to move it. She left it by the door. She fell into a numb routine. She and the boys, they were survivors. They would survive this. They ate the thin stew. She chopped the wood, her hands clumsy, her back aching. They melted snow for water. The world was just the three of them. She tried not to look at the barn. She tried not to look at the woodshed. Samuel stopped carving. He just sat, staring at the fire, his face old again. About a week after the storm, the false thaw returned. The sun came out, weak but present. The snow began to melt, turning the yard into a sea of thick, brown mud. Eleanor was outside, trying to clear a path to the woodshed, when she heard the horses. It was not one rider, it was three. Her heart stopped. It was not the marshal. She knew who it was. She had known, in the back of her mind, that they would be back. It was the ranchers, the same three men who had burned her barn, their leader, a big man named Hatcher, with a red, whiskey-soaked face, rode his horse right up to her porch. His two men fanned out, one moving toward the barn, the other just sitting on his horse, a rifle resting easy across his saddle. "Well, look here," Hatcher said, smiling. It was an ugly expression. "It's the widow Briggs, still here. Thought the winter might have cleaned you out." Eleanor did not move. She held the shovel in her hand, though she knew it was no weapon.
Get off my land, Mr. Hatcher.
Your land? Hatcher laughed. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud near her feet. This ain't your land, Mrs. Briggs. This is cattle range. You squatters come in. You build your little shacks. You run your wire. You ruin it. We told your husband.
My husband is dead,
she said, her voice shaking, but cold. And you're alone, Hatcher said, his smile fading. We heard you had a farmhand, an old fella. Don't see him. Guess he was smart enough to clear out before the real cold set in. He had heard. The marshal must have stopped in town. He had told them she was alone, with a phantom farmhand. He had, in his own way, sealed her fate. I'm telling you to leave, she said. Hatcher swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. He was a big man, and he smelled of sweat and horses. Or what, little widow? You gonna hit me with that shovel? He took a step toward her. We're done asking. We're done being neighborly. This creek is ours. We're burning this shack. Today. And we're running you out. You can walk to town, or you can find another way to be useful. His eyes raked over her, and Eleanor felt a cold, slimy dread that was worse than the fear of death. Samuel, she screamed. Get in the house! Bolt the door! Samuel, who had been frozen on the porch, scrambled inside. The bolt slammed home. Uh-huh, Hatcher laughed. The boy's got spirit. Don't matter. He and the other man on the ground started walking toward her. The third man just watched, his rifle pointed at the cabin. They were cornering her. I've got a rifle, she said, backing up. I'll use it. It's in the cabin, widow, Hatcher said. And you're out here. He was right. Josiah's rifle was inside. With Samuel, she had the shovel. It was hopeless. She was outnumbered. Hatcher lunged. He grabbed the shovel from her hand and threw it aside. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting in like a steel trap. Now, you're gonna be nice, he growled. And we'll let you and the boys walk away. Eleanor screamed. She fought. She kicked him in the shins, raked her nails across his face. He roared, enraged, and backhanded her. The blow was heavy, and it sent her sprawling into the mud. She tasted blood. Stupid woman, he bellowed, wiping the blood from his cheek. You just made it worse. He advanced on her. The other man just laughed. Leave her alone, a voice cried. Samuel was at the window, trying to push the heavy rifle through the opening. Get him! Hatcher yelled at the mounted man. The man raised his rifle. It was over. They were going to kill her. They were going to kill her son. And then, from the ridge, came a sound. A horse, running full out, a man's yell, a sound that was not a word, just a raw, tearing cry of pure rage. Hatcher turned. Eleanor pushed herself up on her elbows. He came over the rise like a ghost. He was on a horse she did not recognize, a mean-looking bay. He was not wearing his coat. He was in his shirt sleeves, his clothes torn, his face and hands black with frostbite. He was bloodied. His hair was wild. He looked like a man who had clawed his way out of a grave. It was Thomas. He rode the horse straight at the mounted man, not slowing. The man, startled, fired his rifle. The shot went wide. Thomas crashed into him. The impact was brutal. Thomas didn't go for his gun. He launched himself from his saddle, tackling the man off his horse. They both hit the mud with a heavy, wet sound. Hatcher and the other man were stunned, frozen. Thomas was on his feet first. He had the other man's rifle. He didn't aim it. He used it as a club, smashing the stock into the man's face. There was a sickening crack. The man went limp. What in the... Hatcher stammered. Thomas threw the rifle down. He turned, panting, his eyes landing on Hatcher. Eleanor had never seen such a look on a human face. It was not anger. It was something colder, something deadlier. It was the look she had feared, the look of a killer. You, Thomas said, his voice a low rasp. Hatcher, fumbling with fear, drew his pistol. Thomas did not stop. He walked toward him. his boots sucking in the mud. He was limping, his body stiff, but he did not stop. Hatcher fired. The bullet kicked up mud at Thomas's feet. He fired again. Wild. Thomas was on him. He did not hit Hatcher. He grabbed him. He grabbed the front of his coat and his gun hand, and he just broke him. He slammed his fist into Hatcher's face. Once. Twice. He twisted the gun from Hatcher's grip and threw it away. Hatcher fell, and Thomas fell on top of him. He was not a farmer. He was not a savior. He was pure, terrible violence. He hit Hatcher again, and again, and again. He was beating him, his fists rising and falling with a grim, steady rhythm. The sounds were awful, wet and heavy. The other man, the one who had laughed, was scrambling for his horse. "He's crazy!" he yelled. "He's killing him!" He got his horse turned and galloped away, fleeing for his life. Thomas did not notice. He was still on Hatcher, his body a rigid line of fury. Hatcher was not moving. He was just a shape in the mud, and Thomas was still hitting him. "Thomas!" Eleanor screamed. She got to her feet, stumbling, her face bloody. "Thomas, stop!" He did not stop. He was lost in the red violence. "Stop!" she screamed again, running to him, grabbing his arm. "You'll kill him! Stop! Thomas, he's done! Stop!" She clung to his arm, the arm that was raised to strike again. He froze. His whole body was trembling, vibrating with the force of his rage. He panted, his breath coming in great, ragged clouds in the cold air. He looked down at the man beneath him, a bloody, broken mess in the mud. He looked at his own hands, bloody and skinned. Then he looked at her. His eyes were still wild. Slowly, like a man waking from a nightmare, he let his arm drop. He rolled off Hatcher. He pushed himself to his knees. And then, with a groan, he dropped, face first, into the mud and did not move. Eleanor stood frozen in the mud, her heart a wild, frantic bird in her chest. She stared at the man who had collapsed, his face pressed into the cold, wet earth. He was not moving. Behind her, Hatcher groaned. It was a low, wet sound. He was alive. The other man, the one Thomas had struck with the rifle, was also stirring, crawling on his hands and knees like a wounded dog. The cabin door creaked open. Samuel stood there, his small face bone white. Josiah's rifle clutched in his hands. "Ma," he whispered. "Ma, your face." Eleanor touched her cheek. Her hand came away bloody from where Hatcher had struck her. The sight of it seemed to break the spell. Get those men's horses. Samuel," she said, her voice a strange, hoarse croak. "Tie their reins to their saddles and get their guns. All of them. Throw them in the creek." Her son, 8 years old, just nodded. He had seen too much. He put the rifle down and did as he was told, his movements stiff. Eleanor knelt beside Thomas. "Thomas," she said, her voice shaking. She put her hands on his shoulders. "Thomas, you have to get up. You cannot stay out here." He was breathing, his body racked with shudders. He was a dead weight. He had spent his last ounce of strength in the fight, and in the journey back to her. "Samuel, help me," she called. Together, the woman and the boy. They dragged him. They hauled him, one arm over her shoulder, one over Samuel's, his boots scraping a deep, muddy trench all the way to the cabin. They got him inside. The man who had left as an outlaw, the man who had returned as she did not know what he was. They spilled onto the floor, collapsing in a heap. Jacob, who had been hiding under the bed, crept out, his eyes wide as saucers. They got him to the pallet by the stove. It was his place. He was half-conscious, his body limp. Eleanor worked. She did not think. She just did. She sent Samuel for water. She pulled off the ruined, frozen boots. She cut away the torn, muddy shirt. His body was a map of new and old miseries. His hands were the worst. They were black and swollen with frostbite. the skin split and raw. His face was just as bad, his cheeks and nose a dark, angry purple. He had scratches on his arms, a new bruise forming on his ribs. He had come through hell to get back to her. She washed the mud and blood from his face with a soft, warm rag. She was so gentle. Her own face was throbbing where Hatcher had hit her, but she felt no pain. She only felt this strange, terrible, aching tenderness. The boys watched. They did not cry. They just stood close. Jacob, her shy Jacob, reached out a small, trembling hand and touched Thomas's arm. At his touch, Thomas's eyes opened. They were fogged with exhaustion and pain. He looked at the small hand on his arm. He looked at Samuel, standing guard. He looked at Eleanor, at her bruised face. He saw the cabin, the warm stove, the two small boys. He saw that they were safe. His throat worked, a dry, rasping sound. His face, the parts that were not black with frost, crumpled. A single tear escaped his right eye. It was a hard, shocking thing. Then another. He turned his head away, into the rough blanket of the pallet, his shoulders shaking with a silent, ragged sob. He was crying. This killer, this outlaw, this hard, silent man was weeping like a lost child. He was not crying from the pain. He was crying. Eleanor knew, because he was home. Eleanor's hand, the one holding the rag, stilled. She watched him, and something in her chest that she thought was long dead, something that had not stirred even for Josiah's passing, broke wide open. "Samuel," she whispered, her own voice thick. "Take your brother. Put the quilt on the floor. You'll sleep by the stove tonight, close to him." She did not want him to be alone. The boys, without a word, made their bed on the floor, on the other side of the stove, their small bodies a silent, protective wall. Eleanor sat in her chair all night, watching him. She tended his hands, wrapping them in clean rags soaked in the last of her lard, a poor substitute for salve. She watched him breathe. She watched her sons, who had curled up instinctively, closer to the wounded man than to their own mother's bed. Hatcher and his man had stumbled away. She had watched from the window as they dragged themselves onto their horses and rode off, broken and beaten. They would not be back, but they would talk. The next morning, Thomas was lucid. The fever from the frostbite was on him, but his eyes were clear. He was weak. He could not move his hands. Eleanor fed him. She spooned thin broth into his mouth, the same way she had fed her boys when they were babies. He did not speak. He just accepted it, his eyes never leaving her face. When he was done, she sat on the edge of the pallet. The boys were outside, checking the rabbit traps Thomas had shown Samuel how to build. "I don't trust you, Thomas," she said, her voice quiet but hard. "I don't think I ever will. I saw what you did to that man. You almost killed him. You wanted to—" His eyes flickered. He looked down at the blankets. "He hit you. That's not a reason to kill a man." "It is," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "To me, it is." She took a shaky breath. "You are everything the marshal said you are. You're a violent man, and you bring violence with you." He nodded, a small, pained movement. He tried to push himself up. "I'll go, soon as I can walk." "No," she said, her voice sharp. She pushed him, gently, back down. "You will not. I sent you out into that storm. I did that. I tried to make you die." You had to," he mumbled. "And you came back," she said, her own voice breaking. "You came back for us. I don't trust you, Thomas Reddick. But I won't let you die alone. Not after this. I owe you that." He closed his eyes. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. That night, the full weight of it all came down on her. The fear, the marshal, the lie, the fight, the sight of Thomas riding in like a dark angel, covered in blood, the knowledge that she had sent him away. The boys were asleep, their breathing deep and even. Thomas was on his pallet, lost in a feverish doze. Eleanor was in her bed, but she could not be still. She was vibrating with a terror and a relief so profound, she felt she would fly apart. She got out of bed. She walked, barefoot, across the cold floor. She knelt by his pallet. He was not asleep. His eyes were open, watching her in the firelight. "You're in pain," she whispered. "It's not so bad. He lied." She looked at his bandaged hands, useless at his sides. She looked at his face, and she broke. The sob was torn out of her. It was a sound of such complete desolation that it startled them both. She put her face in her hands and she wept. She wept for her own bruised face, for her dead husband, for the lies she had told, for the man she had become. She cried because she was so terribly, terribly afraid. "I sent you away," she cried into her hands. I told him you were dead. The marshal, he'll be back. He knows I lied." Thomas, with a groan of pain, moved. He sat up. He did not use his hands. He used his shoulders, his elbows. He pushed himself upright. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had said her name. It sounded like a prayer or a curse. She could not stop crying. She was lost in it. He moved again, shifting his body on the pallet. He could not reach for her. His hands were useless, so he just sat there, a broken, solid presence in the dark. She leaned forward, her body folding, and put her head on his shoulder. She clutched his shirt. She just held on. He was stiff, surprised. Then, slowly, he relaxed. He let her cry. He did not pat her. He did not shush her. He just let his body take the weight of her grief. "I won't run again, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice a rough vibration against her cheek. "I'm tired. I'm so tired of running." She pulled back, her face wet. "He'll come back. Thomas, the marshal. He will. Hatcher will talk." "I know," he said. "I'll go before he does, as soon as I can ride." "No," she said, clutching his arm. Please don't run. Not from this, not from me." He looked at her, his eyes dark and deep in the firelight. "He'll take you in, for helping me." "Then let him," she said, a wild, strange strength in her voice. He looked at her, at this woman who was offering him everything, who was risking her whole world. "I won't run," he promised, his voice raw. "Not unless you ask me to." It was a few days later when they came. The world was quiet, locked in the cold. Eleanor was stirring a pot of thin soup. Thomas was sitting at the table, his bandaged hands resting on the wood, frustration in his eyes. He could not hold a cup. He could not feed himself. Samuel, at the window, said one word: "Riders." Eleanor's heart went to ice. "How many?" "4, no, 5. "It's him," Thomas said. He stood up, his body tense. "The marshal?" "The cellar," Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "Quick, under the floor." "Eleanor, no, I won't hide. Not again." "You will," she hissed. "I won't let him take you. Not like this. Not when you can't even hold a gun. Get in. For me. For the boys." He looked at her, his jaw set. He saw the plea in her eyes. He nodded. He went to the rug, pulled the heavy wooden door open. "What about my things?" "Leave them," she said. "Just go." He slipped into the dark, cold hole. She dropped the door, threw the rug over it, and kicked a stool on top, just as the sound of horses filled the yard. "Boys," she said, her voice shaking. "Go to your bed. Be quiet. Do not say a word." She went to the door. She did not open it. She waited. A heavy knock. "Mrs. Briggs, Marshal Harding, open the door." She took a breath and opened it. He was there, his face like stone. With him were 4 deputies, all with rifles. "Marshal," she said, blocking the doorway. "Ma'am, we got a report from a man named Hatcher. Says he was attacked here by a man he claims was Thomas Reddick.
Hatcher,
Eleanor said, her voice dripping with a cold she did not know she possessed. He's the man who burned my barn. He's the man who shot my husband. He came here to finish the job. He hit me. She pointed to the dark, fading bruise on her cheek. Harding's eyes softened. Just a fraction. I see that, but he says Reddick was here. Marshall, Eleanor said, and she let her voice sound tired and sad and broken. I told you, Thomas Reddick came here. He was sick. He died. I buried him under the barn. Hatcher seems to think he saw a ghost, then a very violent ghost. Hatcher was drunk, Eleanor said, and he was seeing the man he wanted to see. There is no one here, just my sons and me. Harding looked past her, into the small, clean cabin. I'm afraid I have to search. Ma'am, Hatcher's story was detailed. Be my guest, she said, stepping aside. They were not gentle. They tore the small cabin apart. They pulled the blankets off the cots, the boys shrinking back. They looked in her cupboard. One deputy kicked the stool off the rug. Eleanor's breath stopped. The deputy bent down. Cellar door, Marshall. Open it, Harding said. The deputy pulled the rug aside and lifted the door. He held his lantern down. The light was weak. It showed the small, dark space, the shelves of preserves, the sacks of potatoes, the emptiness. Thomas was not there. Eleanor's heart hammered. Where had he gone? Had she imagined him? Nothing but roots and spiders, the deputy said, and dropped the door. Harding was not satisfied. He walked the room. He looked at the boys. He looked at Eleanor. His eyes fell on Thomas's worn carpet bag, shoved under the table. Half hidden, he had not had time to take it. Harding bent down and pulled it out. He set it on the table. Yours, ma'am. It was Mr. Waits, she lied. Arthur Waits, Harding said. The man who never arrived. He opened the bag. There was not much. A change of clothes, a shaving razor, and at the bottom, wrapped in an old, oily cloth, was a gun. He pulled it out. It was a long-barreled revolver, heavy and well cared for. He turned it in his hand. Carved into the walnut grip, plain as day, were the initials T.R. The silence in the cabin was so complete. Eleanor could hear the blood roaring in her ears. Thomas Reddick, Harding said. His voice was not loud. It was soft. It was the voice of a man who had found what he was looking for. No, Eleanor said, her voice a desperate whisper. It was my husband's. Harding looked at her. Josiah Briggs. His initials were J.B. No, she said, the lie coming faster, bigger. His father was named Thomas Rogers. It was his, Josiah kept it. For his father, Thomas Rogers Briggs. The lie was pathetic. It was thin as water. It hung in the air between them, ugly and desperate. The marshal looked at her. He looked at her bruised face. He looked at her chapped, raw hands. He looked at the two small, terrified boys hiding behind her skirts. He looked at the mean, poor cabin. He looked at the gun in his hand, the proof he needed to arrest her, to take her sons, to ruin her. He stood there for a long, long time. Then, slowly, he wrapped the gun back in the oilcloth. He put it back in the bag. He pushed the bag back under the table. That's a fine story, Mrs. Briggs, he said. He walked to the door. Men, ride out. We're done here. The deputies looked confused, but they filed out, mounting their horses. Harding stood in the doorway, putting on his hat. Ma'am, he said, his voice low, for her and her alone. That man Hatcher, he's a coward, but he's got friends. And this territory is full of men who like to take what isn't theirs. He looked her square in the eye. Be careful who you shelter. Some men are trouble. But some men are the only thing that stands between you and the trouble that's already here." He tipped his hat. "Good day, ma'am." He got on his horse and rode away. Eleanor stood at the door, her legs shaking so badly she had to hold the frame. She watched them until they were tiny black specks, until they were gone. She shut the door. She bolted it. "Thomas?" she called, her voice a whisper. "The woodshed?" He must have. The sound came from the barn, the small stable part, the loft. He dropped down from the loft, landing silently in the straw. He had gone out the window. While she was talking to the marshal, he had slipped out the back window and hidden in the one place they would not look twice. He walked into the cabin. He looked at the mess the deputies had made. He looked at her. "He knows," she said. "He knows," Thomas agreed. He looked pale. "He let me go. He let you go. He won't do it a second time. I have to leave. Tonight." "No." He looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. "Look at your hands," she said, pointing. They were still wrapped in white rags. "You're not healed. That frostbite, you can't even hold your reins, let alone a gun. You'll die out there. The cold will take you, or Hatcher's friends will." "It's better than getting you hanged." Eleanor. "No," she said. She walked right up to him. She was no longer shaking. She was solid. "He warned me. He didn't arrest me. He warned me. He gave me a choice. I'm choosing." "You can't. I'm a wanted man." "You're the man who came back," she said, her voice fierce. "You're the man who sat with my son. You're the man who saved us. I won't be alone again." The plea was raw. "Stay," she begged, her voice finally breaking. "Please, just until the spring, just until the thaw. Your hands will be healed. The ground will be soft. You can ride then. You'll have a chance." He looked down at her, at this impossible, stubborn, brave woman. He looked at his own useless, bandaged hands. He had nowhere to go, and for the first time in his life, he did not want to run. Just until the thaw, he agreed. The cabin settled. The winter locked them in, but it was not the same. The pallet by the fire was gone. Thomas slept in her bed. He slept in Josiah's bed. At first, it was strange and stiff. Two people, side by side, listening to the wind, not touching. But the nights were so cold, and the darkness was so long. One night, she woke from a nightmare, gasping. She was dreaming of Hatcher, of the fire. She sat bolt upright. Thomas was awake beside her. "You're all right," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. And his hand, his left hand, the one that was not as badly frostbitten, found hers in the dark. He just held it, his fingers wrapped around hers. After that, they were never not touching. They would lie in the dark, her back pressed against his chest, his arm around her, or they would face each other, their hands clasped between them, his feet cold against hers. They did not talk. They just held on. It was a quiet, constant, desperate anchor in the dark. He healed. His hands were scarred, the skin on his knuckles a pale, shiny pink, but his fingers worked. He started carving again. He fixed the broken chair. He taught Samuel how to track in the snow. The boys, they had seen the violence, and they had seen the rescue. They had seen the marshal. They did not understand the details, but they understood the truth. This man was theirs. One night, they were all at the table. Thomas was showing Samuel how to resole a boot. "When you pull the thread, Pa," Jacob said, his small voice clear in the quiet room. "It makes a funny noise." The word hung in the air. Pa. Eleanor froze. Thomas's hands, the ones holding the awl, went still. Samuel looked at his little brother, his face red. "Jacob, you're supposed to call him." "It's all right, Samuel," Thomas said. His voice was rough. He cleared his throat. It does make a funny noise. Jacob." He went back to his work. But the word was spoken, and it was not taken back. Jacob said it, and then, a few days later, Samuel said it, quiet and shy, but firm. "Pa, can you show me the trap again?" Eleanor watched, her heart so full it ached. They were a family. It was all built on a lie, on stolen time. It was a fragile, dangerous thing, but it was theirs. They were just 4 people in a small cabin, holding their breath, waiting for the spring. The snow was not a shroud anymore. It was a memory. It retreated, patch by patch, leaving the earth dark, wet and smelling of mud and life. The creek, which had been a ribbon of ice, began to talk again, a low, gurgling sound. The world was thawing, and so, it seemed, was the small, scarred family in the cabin. Thomas's hands healed. The skin was a new, shiny, puckered pink over his knuckles, and he would never lose the stiffness in 2 of his fingers. But they were his hands again, and he put them to work. He was not a farmer, that was true, but he was a builder. He was a man who understood wood and stone and how to make things hold. He and Samuel, they started to rebuild the barn. They salvaged what charred timber was still strong, and they rode the mule, the one Thomas had bought, or maybe stolen, on his ride back, up into the high country to cut new pine. Eleanor watched them. Her son, who had been a small, old man, was a boy again. He followed Thomas, mimicking his long, limping stride, handing him the hammer, learning to notch a log. And Eleanor, she planted seeds. She took a patch of ground near the cabin, a place that caught the morning sun, and she turned the soil. She planted the beans and squash seeds the preacher's wife had brought. As she pressed the small, hard seeds into the damp earth, she felt something in her chest unknot. One afternoon, Thomas was on the new roof of the barn, nailing shingles. He looked down, and he saw her, kneeling in her garden, her bonnet pushed back. She was looking at a small, green shoot that had pushed its way through the soil, and she smiled. It was not the tight, pained twist of her mouth he was used to. It was a real smile, a small, quiet thing that lit up her whole face. It hit him harder than Hatcher's fist. The thaw brought the stagecoach back, and the stage brought a letter. It was from Cheyenne. It was addressed to Mrs. E. Briggs. Eleanor took it, her hands trembling. Letters, like telegrams, only meant bad news. She waited until the stage was gone, until she was alone in the cabin. Thomas was at the creek, checking the water. She opened it. The paper was official. It was from the U.S. Marshal's office. Her heart hammered. She read it once, her eyes blurring, and then she read it again, and again. It was a short, formal notice. It said that the wanted man, Thomas Reddick, was now legally declared deceased. His last known alias and description matched a body found in a saloon fire in Leadville. The body had been found with Reddick's known possessions, including a marked deck of cards and a silver flask. The notice was signed by a clerk. But underneath, in a different, stronger hand, was a personal note. Mrs. Briggs, I thought you would want to know. The man you said you buried is now officially buried. The U.S. government considers the matter of Thomas Reddick closed. You are no longer wanted for any questions. J. Harding. Eleanor's knees gave out. She sank onto the stool. The letter clutched in her hand. A sound came out of her, a high, thin sound, half sob, half scream. It was the sound of a pressure valve, of a year of terror, finally letting go. She put her head down on the table, and she wept. She wept from a place so deep inside her she did not know it existed. It was a flood of pure, unadulterated relief. Thomas heard the cry. He burst through the door, his hand instinctively flying to the gun he now wore, his face pale. What is it? Is it the boys? Are they back? She could not speak. She was shaking too hard. She just held the letter out to him. He stared at it. Eleanor, What I can't. He could not read. She wiped her face, her hands shaking. She read it to him. She read the formal part, and then she read the note from Harding. Thomas just stood there. He looked lost. He was a man adrift. Dead? He said, his voice a hoarse whisper. They think but I'm right here. Another man stole my things, stole my name. I know, she said, and she stood up. She was still crying, but she was smiling, the same smile she'd had in the garden. Oh, Thomas, don't you see? See what? He asked. He looked stunned. It's a mistake. It's a miracle, she said. She went to him. She grabbed the front of his rough, collarless shirt. It means Thomas Reddick is dead. He's a ghost. He's a pile of ashes in Colorado. She poked him, hard, in the chest. This man, the man standing in my house, he's just a man. He has no name. He has no past. He's not wanted. She put her hands on his face, her thumbs brushing his scarred cheeks. It means, she whispered, her voice thick, that we can build something real. He stared at her, the meaning of it slowly dawning. He was free, not because he had been pardoned, but because he had been erased. He put his bandaged hand over hers, holding it to his face. He said nothing. He just closed his eyes. For a week, the world was quiet. They worked, they rebuilt the fences. They ate their meals, and the shadow was gone from the table. Thomas laughed, a low, rusty sound, when Jacob spilled a cup of milk all over his lap. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh. They were, for one short, bright week, just a family. And then the ranchers struck again. They had been quiet, terrified of the man they thought was a ghost. But Hatcher, broken and humiliated, had been talking, and now, with the thaw, their greed was stronger than their fear. They did not come in the day. They came at night, like cowards. Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke, but it was not the barn. They had burned the new fences. They had torn down the new corral, and in the dark, they had poisoned the well. They had thrown 2 dead, bloating sheep into it, ruining the water, their one source of life. It was a final, killing blow. Eleanor stood at the edge of the well in the gray dawn, Thomas at her side. She looked at the fouled water. This was it. They could not survive this. They could not haul water 10 miles from town. They could not dig a new well before summer. The old Eleanor would have crumpled. She would have packed her bags. She turned to Thomas. His face was a mask of cold, quiet rage. He was ready to ride. He was ready to hunt them down. No, she said, her voice hard. Not your way. Not this time. She went into the cabin. She put on her good dress, the dark wool one she had been married in. She brushed her hair until it was smooth. She came back out. Thomas, she said, saddle the mule and the horse. We're going to town. For what? Supplies? For justice, she said. You're not hiding. I'm not hiding. Not anymore. They rode into town. It was a Sunday morning. They did not look like a desperate widow and her farmhand. She sat straight and tall on the mule. He rode beside her, his new-heeled hands resting on his saddle horn, his gun in its holster, plain for all to see. He was not a man to be trifled with. They were a pair. They were a force. They went to the sheriff's office. The sheriff was a small, tired man with a stained vest, who liked his office chair more than his job. Mrs. Briggs, he sighed. What is it now? Mr. Hatcher and his men poisoned my well last night, Eleanor said, her voice clear and cold. The sheriff sighed again. He leaned back. Now, Eleanor, that's a mighty strong accusation. You see them do it? I don't need to see them. It's the same men who burned my barn. The same men who... Look, the sheriff said, cutting her off. It's a dispute. It's his land against yours. There's nothing I can do. I don't have proof. You best just try to be a good neighbor. A good neighbor, she repeated, her voice flat. They are trying to kill my family." "I can't help you," he said, turning to his paperwork. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm a busy man." Thomas took a step forward, his hand moving slightly. Eleanor put her arm out, blocking him. "No," she said. She turned and walked out of the office. "Eleanor, where are you going?" Thomas asked, following her into the dusty street. "He's a busy man," she said, her voice shaking with a white-hot fury. "He's going to church. So are we." The bell was ringing. The small, white-painted church was full. The preacher was just opening his Bible. Eleanor Briggs walked through the door. The sound of her boots on the wooden floor made the preacher stop. Every head in town turned. They saw her, in her good dress, with the bruise on her face. And they saw the man who stood behind her, a tall, scarred stranger, his eyes cold, his hand resting near his gun. He stopped at the door, a guard, letting her walk. She walked down the center aisle. She walked all the way to the front, and she turned. She stood next to the shocked preacher, and she faced them. She faced the whole town. "I'm sorry, preacher," she said. "I have to speak." "Mrs. Briggs," he stammered. "My name is Eleanor Briggs," she said, her voice ringing in the silent, holy room. "My husband, Josiah, is buried on the hill by my burned-out barn. He was a good man. You all knew him. You know he was a good man." People shifted in their pews. "He was killed," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He was shot by men who wanted our land, men working for Mr. Hatcher. They burned my barn. They killed my livestock. And you all sent condolences. You sent pies, but you did nothing." The silence was terrible. It was the sound of shame. "They came back. They threatened me, a widow, alone, with 2 sons. They came back, and I was alone. I was terrified. And last night, they came again. They burned my new fences, and they poisoned my well. They are trying to starve me out, to kill my sons." She pointed. She pointed right at a man in the 3rd pew. "Mr. Hatcher, you and your men, you did this. You are a coward, and you are a murderer." Hatcher, his face purple, stood up. "Now you listen here. You." "And you," she said, her voice cutting over his, pointing to the sheriff, who was trying to look small in the back row. "You sit there, in God's house, and you tell me it is a neighborly dispute. You will not help. You let them do this." She was shaking. She was crying, but she did not stop. "I am a woman, and I have been alone, but I am not alone anymore." She pointed back to the door, to Thomas. He was standing there, his face like stone, a protector. This man saved us. He is the man who stood up when no one in this town would. You whisper about him. You call him a stranger, but he has done more for this town, for my family, than any of you. He is a better man than all of you." She finished. She stood there, panting, tears streaming down her face. The church was dead silent. Hatcher, his face black with rage, stormed out, slamming the door. Eleanor turned. She walked, head high, back down the aisle. Thomas stepped aside, opened the door for her, and followed her out into the bright, silent street. They got on their horses, and they rode home, without looking back. They did not speak. When they got back to the cabin, the poisoned well was still there. The burned fences were still black. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. That afternoon, a wagon creaked up the road. It was the preacher. His wife was beside him. She got down, carrying a basket. "Eleanor," she said, not looking at Thomas. We are ashamed. We brought food, and the preacher, he brought his water barrels. You can have what's in our cistern, until you can fix this." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you." Another wagon. It was the blacksmith. He was a big, quiet man. He grunted at Thomas. Heard you had a fence problem. He said he had a wagon full of new cut posts. And I heard about your well. My sons are strong. We'll help you dig. We'll find a new spring. Thomas just looked at the man. He nodded once. All afternoon, they came, a few women, bringing quilts and sacks of flour and seeds. They were small, quiet offerings of atonement. They were, finally, help. The town, shamed into action, was standing up. The next morning, the land was soft. The blacksmith and his sons were already at the creek, looking for a new place to dig. Thomas was in the garden. He was on his knees, in the mud, with Samuel and Jacob. He was planting the new corn seeds a woman had brought. He was showing Samuel, his scarred hands gentle on his sons, how to set the seed in the earth. Jacob was following, patting the dirt down. Eleanor stood on the porch, a cup of coffee in her hand. She watched them, this man, this killer, this outlaw on his knees, in the mud, planting corn. He must have felt her watching. He looked up. He saw her, and his face, which was always so guarded, softened. He stood, wiping his muddy hands on his trousers, and walked to the porch. He stood beside her. They watched the boys, who were now pretending to be crows, hopping over the new rows. "I've never belonged anywhere before," he whispered. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the field. "My whole life. I've been running. Since I was a boy, I never had a place, or folks." He paused. I've never planted anything. Never put a seed in the ground. Never thought I'd see it grow." Eleanor set her cup down. She took his hand, his big, rough, scarred hand. She threaded her fingers through his. "You belong here, Thomas," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was fierce. It was a vow. "With us, as you are, not as Arthur Waits, not as a ghost, as you belong here." He looked down at their joined hands. He did not say anything. He just squeezed her fingers. That night, the world was alive. The cabin was quiet, the boys asleep. The new well was already started. The fences were being mended. There was a ham, a gift from the preacher, hanging from the rafters. The air, coming in the open window, was soft, smelling of spring mud and pine. It was the sound of life. She was brushing her hair by the firelight. He was sitting on the bed, watching her. She put the brush down. She turned to him. The long months of fear, of winter, of desperation, were gone. There was just this man. She went to him. She knelt in front of him, and she took his hands. She kissed his scarred knuckles, one by one. He pulled her up. He pulled her onto his lap, his arms going around her. This time it was not the desperate, hungry clash in the storm. It was not the silent, comforting anchor in the dark. It was slow. It was certain. It was two people who had seen the worst of each other and had chosen to stay. It was a promise. He laid her on the bed. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear and deep, and all the hardness, all the years of running, was gone. There was only tenderness. She clutched his face, pulling him down to her. She held him, his familiar, solid weight, the feel of his skin. "You're not my mistake," she whispered, the words torn from the very bottom of her soul. "You're my answer." The summer came. The corn grew tall, a bright, shocking green against the dry land. The new barn stood, strong and solid, smelling of fresh pine. The new well was sweet and cold. The story closes on a warm, golden evening. Eleanor and Thomas are standing on their porch. They are not touching, but they stand close, their shoulders almost brushing, as comfortable and solid as the house itself. She wears a clean apron. He has his sleeves rolled up, his arms brown from the sun. They are watching their sons, Samuel and Jacob, whooping and laughing, are racing through the tall, wild grass down by the creek. They are chasing grasshoppers, their hair bright in the setting sun. Eleanor looks at Thomas. He is watching the boys, and on his face, his hard, scarred face, is a small, quiet smile. At last, they were a family, no longer surviving. They were, finally, beginning to live. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to hear your thoughts. And please, comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories just like this.